Caleb Warren's shadow stretched long across the cemetery's wet stones, as if trying to escape him. He hadn't planned to stop, but Lena Brooks was there, curled against the gravestone. A photo frame pressed to her chest like a shield. Her voice, barely a breath, carried over the rain. "You're not the one I buried." Those words sank into Caleb, sharp as a bayonet, promising a homecoming where the Real fight was just beginning. Caleb Warren drove with the kind of focus that came from years of crossing landscapes where a wrong glance could get you killed. Out here, in the soft rain of early spring, the danger was gone, but the habit clung to him. He kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes steady on the dark ribbon of road that wound its way through the middle of town. The headlights cut a narrow path ahead, catching the slow dance of raindrops as they fell, each one bursting into a tiny star before fading into the wet blacktop. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and the smoke from someone's wood stove a few blocks over. He'd just left the Veterans Memorial Service at the town hall, a low, brick building with peeling white trim. The speeches had been respectful, the kind where people nod and murmur thank you for your service, but his mind had drifted halfway through. Words like sacrifice and honor had a way of sliding off him now. The faces in the room were familiar, but they felt like photographs, still two-dimensional, separate from him. On the passenger seat sat his old field jacket, folded neatly, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. A couple of condolence letters were tucked in the inside pocket, unopened. He'd been carrying them for weeks, maybe months. Time had blurred in a way it didn't used to. Rain tapped against the windshield, light but steady. That sound used to soothe him when he was a boy, summer nights on his parents' porch. The smell of wet grass drifting in, but in the desert it had meant mud, slowed convoys, and the risk of getting stuck. Tonight, it was somewhere in between, familiar yet uneasy. The dashboard clock read just before 10. He didn't turn on the radio. The silence inside the cab felt safer, more honest. Music had a way of pulling you toward feelings you weren't ready for, and he'd learned to let the quiet do its work. Outside, the street lamps leaned over the road like tired sentries, their halos of light breaking up the darkness in brief, reluctant intervals. As he passed the corner where Main Street gave way to Forest Hill Road, the change was immediate. Fewer houses, more trees, the outlines of two shuttered flower shops, and farther down, the bent frame of an old payphone booth. The road narrowed as it approached the iron gates of Forest Hill Cemetery, their black bars slick with rain. He'd driven this stretch hundreds of times. It was the quickest way home. But tonight something pressed against his awareness, the way a sudden change in wind can signal a coming storm. At first it was just a shape in the distance, a darker, not against the muted glow of the street lamp. He eased his foot off the gas. The figure was small, motionless. The closer he got, the clearer it became. Not a heap of clothes or a stray animal, but a person. The kind of stillness that spoke not of rest, but of endurance. His tires hissed on the wet pavement as he slowed to a crawl. The headlights reached her, and there she was, a child, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped tight as if she could hold in her own heat. Rain clung to her hair, turning it into thin ropes that plastered against her cheeks. Beside her, just visible in the white beam, was something rectangular propped against her shins. Caleb pulled over to the shoulder and sat for a second, engine idling, his hands loose on the wheel. He felt that tug in his chest, the one he used to get when a patrol spotted something unexpected, half a second to decide whether to pass it by or stop and change the rest of the night. It struck him then, the strangeness of it all. He was back home, years away from sand and gunfire, but the choice still felt the same. Go forward and take on whatever came, or keep driving and let it become someone else's problem. The rain deepened, tiny percussion on the hood. He switched off the engine. The headlights stayed on, casting a long white triangle that seemed to pin the girl in place, like a photograph caught mid-breath. When he opened the door, the cold hit him in the face, sharp, clean, with the smell of wet iron from the cemetery gates. He stepped onto the shoulder, the grit and water soaking into the leather of his boots, and for a moment he just stood there, watching her. There was a strange clarity in the air, as if the world had narrowed to this patch of road, this child, this night. Somewhere behind the veil of rain, his own reflection stared back at him, a man still carrying a war inside, standing in the quiet heart of his hometown, about to decide what came next. And though he didn't know it yet, the way her small frame leaned into that picture she held, protective, unwilling to let go, will be the first crack in the shell he'd been living in since he returned. Not a rescue. Not yet. Just a recognition, sharp and certain, that he was still here. And maybe, just maybe, he could start looking forward again. The rain had a way of softening everything, blurring the edges of street signs and shadows alike. Caleb moved slowly, each step sinking just enough into the softened shoulder of the road to release the scent of wet asphalt. The girl didn't stir at first. She was folded into herself, chin tucked, the picture frame locked against her chest, as if it were the only solid thing in the world. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. Years in uniform had taught him the value of approach. Never too quick, never straight on. The kind of pace that let the other person decide whether to trust you. Up close, the details came into focus. Her hair was darker than he'd thought, almost black when it caught the light. It clung to her cheeks in thin, wet strands. Her jacket, if you could call it that, was 2 sizes too big. The cuffs torn and hanging loose around her wrists. The shoes on her feet had lost their shape entirely. The leather warped from water, laces trailing like loose threads. The frame she clutched was wooden, the varnish worn down in places where fingers had gripped too tightly. Inside, behind glass smudged with rain, was a photograph of a man in uniform. The edges of the picture curled slightly, as though it had been carried for a long time without a case. Caleb's gaze lingered on the insignia at the man's shoulder, the straightness of his posture, the clear, direct look in his eyes. The name came back to him like an echo. Turner. The girl's eyes opened slowly, as if from a half-sleep. They were red, not from crying, but from the kind of exhaustion that hollows a person out. For a moment, she just stared at him. No panic, no relief, just the guarded stillness of someone who'd learned to wait out strangers. Caleb didn't speak right away. Words felt clumsy in moments like this. Instead, he lowered himself to a crouch so his eyes were level with hers. The rain slid down his collar, cold against the back of his neck. She blinked once, twice, then whispered something so soft he almost didn't hear it over the patter of water on the road. "I'm waiting for my dad." Her voice caught at the end, but she didn't look away. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement, the kind that carried its own weight. Caleb glanced at the photograph again and felt a small jolt in his chest. He'd stood in formation with that man once, Adam Turner, as ceremony overseas. Not close friends, but the kind of bond that comes from wearing the same uniform in the same dust-choked air. He thought of the years since, the men who'd made it home, the ones who hadn't, and the ones who come back only to find they no longer fit in the lives they'd left behind. Caleb looked over his shoulder. The road was empty, the cemetery gate behind him yawning open just enough for a person to slip through. A few headstones nearest the gate caught the light, their names blurred by distance and rain. Beyond them, darkness pressed in like a held breath. When he turned back, she had tucked her chin again, eyes half-lidded. The photo frame was a barrier and a lifeline. He could feel the urge to say something comforting, but he knew better than to promise anything yet. A gust of wind swept across the road, carrying the faint rustle of leaves from the big oak inside the cemetery. It made her shiver, just slightly, the movement so small most people wouldn't have noticed. Caleb noticed. He eased off his coat, canvas heavy, lined for warmth, and held it in both hands for a moment, letting the motion be deliberate. No sudden movements. He draped it gently over her shoulders, careful not to touch the frame in her arms. The coat was far too big, but the weight of it seemed to pull her upright a little, as if the extra warmth reminded her she still had a body to hold herself up in. Caleb stayed there a moment longer, the rain pooling in the lines of his knuckles. The thought crossed his mind that he could turn back to his truck, call someone, police, social services, and let them handle it. That's what the system was for, wasn't it? But he'd seen too many systems fail the people who needed them most. He remembered the quiet after-action reports, the ones that boiled whole lives down to a sentence. No further action required. He'd read those lines about friends. He wasn't about to let them write one for her. When she finally met his eyes again, there was still no trust there, but something else. Acknowledgement, maybe. The smallest recognition that he hadn't walked past. That was enough for now. He straightened slowly, the ache in his knees reminding him of the miles he'd carried in boots heavier than the rain-soaked pair he wore tonight. Standing over her, he glanced once more toward the road, then toward the open gate of the cemetery. Somewhere in that space between the two, he made the quiet decision that this night wasn't going to end with him leaving her here. The rain had picked up slightly, drumming a steadier rhythm on the hood of his truck. It sounded, oddly, like the start of something. Not the march of boots or the rattle of gunfire, but a slower, steadier beat. The kind you could walk alongside without rushing. And in that moment, Caleb felt the faintest shift inside himself. Still a stranger in his own life. Still unsure where he belonged, but tonight at least he knew where he needed to stand. The walk back to the truck was short, but Caleb took it slowly, letting the girl set the pace. Her steps were careful, almost tentative, the way a person moves when they've been sitting in the cold for too long. She kept both arms wrapped around the picture frame, the coat slipping a little at her shoulders, trailing almost to her knees. The interior light flickered on as he opened the passenger door. She hesitated at the threshold, looking into the cab like it was another kind of unknown. Caleb stepped aside, not rushing her. Eventually she climbed in, tucking the frame onto her lap before reaching for the seatbelt. The motion was mechanical, practiced. Once he was behind the wheel again, he didn't start the engine right away. The rain tapped at the roof in a steady rhythm, drops streaking down the glass in long, uneven lines. The cab smelled faintly of leather and the lingering smoke from the service hall earlier in the evening. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice low. For a while, she didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the windshield, watching the rain like it was the only thing in motion. When she finally spoke, it was so quiet he almost missed it. "Lena." A pause, then, "Lena Brooks." The syllables sat in the air between them, thin but steady. Caleb nodded, the name lodging itself somewhere deep, a piece of information that felt heavier than its weight in sound. They drove without much more said. Forest Hill Road stretched ahead, lined with bare-limbed maples and the occasional clapboard house set far back from the street. Street lamps cast pale, watery light over front yards, each one a small island in the dark. Caleb stole a glance at her when they passed under one of those lamps. The glow caught on the curve of her cheek, the glint of water in her hair. She wasn't crying, but there was something in her posture that made him think of soldiers sitting on the edge of a cot, waiting for orders they already knew were coming. A mile or so later, he slowed near a corner store where a single neon open sign blinked in the window. He pulled in, killed the engine. "Back in a minute," he said, but she stayed rigid in her seat, arms still around the frame. Inside, the store was nearly empty. He grabbed 2 bottles of water, a pack of crackers, and a small packet of tissues. It wasn't much, but it felt like a start. When he came back, she took the water without a word, twisting off the cap and drinking like someone who'd been measuring every sip for too long. They were halfway through town when he saw the lights of a florist shop up ahead. It was late for it to be open, but as they rolled closer, he realized it wasn't. The glow came from a lamp behind the counter. A figure stood in the doorway, leaning on the frame of a weathered umbrella. It was Ruth Leland, who'd been running that shop longer than Caleb had been alive. She squinted toward the truck, then raised her free hand in a small, slow wave. Caleb pulled over. "You've seen her?" "Huh." Ruth's voice carried easily over the soft hiss of rain. Caleb leaned out the window. "She was at the gate." "She's been there since yesterday," Ruth said flatly. "Called the police myself. They said they'd come, but," she shrugged, the motion tugging at the umbrella, "no one's shown yet." Caleb glanced at Lena. She was watching Ruth, eyes narrowed, like she was trying to decide whether this woman was another passerby or someone different. Ruth tilted her head toward the girl. "Did she tell your name?" "Lena," Caleb answered. Ruth nodded. "She wouldn't tell me. Just sat there, hugging that photo like it was part of her." She shifted her umbrella to her other hand. "I told folks she was there. They just steered clear. Nobody wants to get involved these days." Caleb didn't reply. There wasn't much to say to that. The truth of it sat heavy in the air, like the damp settling into your coat. When he eased the truck back onto the road, Lena adjusted the coat on her shoulders, still keeping the frame pressed to her chest. Caleb noticed her glance out the window toward the florist sign, but she didn't speak. It struck him that in the last hour, he'd learned more about her from other people than from her own mouth. But then, he knew what it was to keep your words close. Sometimes silence was the only control you had left. As they left the last of the town lights behind, the road opened into stretches of unlit asphalt, flanked by dark fields. The hum of the tires and the rain on the roof were the only sounds. Caleb found his thoughts drifting, not to the war, not to the service tonight, but to the name she'd given him. Lena Brooks. He wondered how many times she'd said it in the past year, and whether anyone had bothered to remember it. by the time they reached the turnoff toward Caleb's house. The rain had settled into a fine mist, the kind that clings to your skin without you realizing it until later. He eased the truck onto the gravel driveway, tires crunching softly, and parked beside the old woodpile stacked against the fence. The porch light cast a pale yellow fan across the front steps, just enough to make the worn boards visible. He killed the engine, but didn't move right away. Lena sat still, eyes forward, the frame in her lap like a seatbelt she trusted more than the real one. Caleb stepped out first, the cool, damp air rushing in as he opened his door. Gravel shifted under his boots, that small sound carrying in the quiet. He walked around to her side and opened the passenger door. She looked at him, then at the house, as if measuring the space between the two. Finally, she climbed down, landing lightly, holding the frame to her chest with both arms. The coat slid further down her shoulders, swallowing her small frame almost completely. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar from the coat rack and the coffee he'd brewed that morning. The living room was modest, 2 worn armchairs, a small couch, a bookshelf with more empty space than books, and a narrow mantel where a few framed photographs leaned against the wall. Caleb hung his jacket and nodded toward the couch. "You can sit there if you want." She lowered herself to the edge of the cushion, legs pulled close, shoes leaving faint wet prints on the rug. She didn't look around much, but her eyes flicked briefly to the photographs on the mantel. One in particular, a girl of about 6, grinning, her hair in 2 uneven braids, seemed to hold her attention. "That's my daughter," Caleb said quietly from the kitchen doorway. "She's been gone a while now." Lena didn't answer. Her gaze dropped to the picture in her own arms, thumb brushing along the edge of the frame. Caleb filled the kettle, set it on the stove. The hiss of water heating filled the space between them. From the cupboard, he took down 2 mugs, one with a chipped rim and the faded logo of a long-closed diner. He found a tin of cocoa powder, measured out enough for 2. When the water boiled, he poured it over the cocoa, stirring until the steam rose in twisting ribbons. He carried 1 mug into the living room, setting it on the low table near her knees. "It's warm," he said. She glanced at it, then back at the photo. "I'm not hungry," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's just something to take the chill off." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she shifted forward, resting the frame against her knees to free one hand. She took the mug in both hands, as if its weight might slip through her fingers otherwise. The heat seemed to startle her, like she'd forgotten what it felt like. Caleb sat in the armchair opposite, his own mug resting untouched in his hands. "You can stay here tonight," he said after a while. "Think of it as shelter from the rain." Her eyes lifted, meeting his for the first time since they'd left the cemetery. "I'm not staying," she said softly. "I'm waiting for my dad." The words settled in the room, neither challenged nor echoed. Caleb knew better than to argue with someone's waiting. Waiting was a place all its own, and you couldn't pull someone out of it before they were ready. He nodded once, slowly, and sipped his cocoa. Across the room, on the mantel, the smiling photograph of his daughter seemed to tilt slightly in the dim light, as if leaning toward them. Caleb felt that familiar hollow open in his chest, the space where she used to be, the space where sound and time bent differently. Outside, the rain had stopped altogether. The silence left behind felt almost heavier. Somewhere down the road, a lone car passed, tires whispering against wet pavement. Lena set her empty mug back on the table. Without a word, she pulled the coat tighter, curled against the arm of the couch, and rested the frame against her chest again. Caleb stayed in his chair a while longer, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She hadn't said much, but in the way she held that picture, firm, unyielding, he could read the same thing he'd carried back from war. The knowledge that some absences are so deep they shape the way you move through the world. And sitting there, in the dim light of his own living room, he realized he didn't mind the quiet. Not tonight. It was enough that she was here, and that neither of them had turned away. Caleb woke before dawn, not because of an alarm, but because his body had been trained for years to rise with the light, or the memory of it. The house was still, the kind of stillness that made every small sound stand out. The creak of the old floorboards when he stepped into the hallway, the soft groan of the front porch in the wind. In the living room, Lena was exactly where he'd last seen her. Curled up at one end of the couch, his coat wrapped around her like a cocoon, the picture frame tucked under her chin. The blanket he'd left folded on the back of the couch was still untouched. She'd chosen the weight of the coat and the photograph over anything else. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment, not wanting to wake her. The early light filtering through the thin curtains cast a faint gold over the room, making the edges of her hair glow. She wasn't crying. She wasn't restless. She was still in that same guarded posture, like someone who knows that rest can be broken without warning. He retreated quietly to the kitchen. The floor in here was colder, the linoleum worn thin near the stove. He set a pot of water to heat, oatmeal for himself, maybe for her if she would take it, and pulled down 2 mugs from the shelf. Steam began to rise from the pot, and the smell of cocoa filled the air. By the time he carried the tray back into the living room, she'd stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the light, her arms tightening on the frame for an instant before she seemed to remember where she was. "Morning," he said softly, setting the tray on the table. She sat up, still holding the picture, and glanced at the bowls. Her voice was quieter than the clink of the spoon as he ladled oatmeal into her bowl. "I'm not hungry," she murmured. "It's warm," he said. "Good for your stomach on a day like this." After a pause, she shifted the frame to her lap and reached for the spoon. She ate in small, deliberate bites, as if she were rationing it. Caleb didn't push. He learned long ago that food wasn't just about hunger. It was about trust, too. When she finished, she set the spoon down carefully and drew the coat around her again. Caleb noticed for the first time how the sleeves hung past her fingertips, the frayed ends brushing the fabric of the couch. "Your clothes are wet from last night," he said. "I've got some of my daughter's old things that might fit you." She didn't answer, but when he stood and walked toward the back room, she followed. The room smelled faintly of cedar and something older, time maybe. He opened a drawer and pulled out a cream-colored sweatshirt and a pair of jeans that would be a little loose, but warmer than what she had. She took them without a word and disappeared into the bathroom. A few minutes later, she emerged, the sweatshirt hanging just past her hips, the jeans cuffed above her ankles. The coat had been draped over her arm, the frame clutched in her other hand. On her way back to the couch, she paused in front of the bookshelf. A framed photo stood among a scattering of paperbacks. A girl in pigtails, beaming beside Caleb in uniform. Lena looked at it for a long moment. "That's my daughter," Caleb said quietly from the doorway. "She passed away a few years ago." Lena's head dipped, just enough to acknowledge the weight of the words. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It's all right," he replied. "Some things don't go away. You just learn how to carry them." The room fell into a stillness that wasn't heavy, just present. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the siding, a reminder that winter hadn't yet loosened its grip. Caleb sat in the armchair again, watching as she settled back onto the couch. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the old wall clock, marking each second as though it might matter. He didn't know why she'd been left there. Not yet, but he knew what it meant to endure 2 days alone in the cold, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. And he knew he wasn't going to let her go back to that gate. For now, that was enough. By late morning, a pale sun had pushed through the thinning clouds, throwing muted light across the living room rug. Caleb sat at the small dining table, a mug of coffee cooling between his hands. Lena was on the couch again, cross-legged now, his coat pulled around her hips. She was tracing the beveled edge of the picture frame with one finger, her gaze locked somewhere far beyond the glass. He let the quiet stretch. It was the same quiet he'd known in a field tent between deployments, soldiers staring at the same map for hours, no one speaking until they were ready. Pushing someone to talk before they wanted to never ended well. Eventually, without looking up, she said, "We were supposed to go see my dad." Caleb didn't move, just shifted his eyes toward her. She took a breath that sounded like it caught halfway down her chest. "She drove me to the cemetery. Stopped at the gate. Told me to wait. Said it was a surprise." Her voice was flat, but there was a tension underneath like rope pulled too tight. He understood the way she avoided naming she. Sometimes leaving a name out was its own kind of truth. At first I thought maybe she went to get something, or to park, but Lena's fingers tightened on the frame. It got dark. Then it rained. Nobody came. Caleb let the words settle. Outside, a car passed, its tires sending up a hiss on the wet pavement. "She's my dad's new wife," Lena said after a moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph. "After he died, I had to live with her and her daughter." Her shoulders drew in. She said I was a burden, that I ate too much, snored too loud, that I didn't belong. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He knew the sting of being told you didn't belong in your own life. I knew she wasn't coming back, Lena said, still in that steady, unbroken tone. But I didn't want to cry. My dad didn't like it when I acted weak. Something shifted in Caleb's chest. An old ache, not the sharp pain of a wound, but the dull, steady weight of it. You didn't do anything wrong, he said finally, his voice low. She didn't respond, only looked back down at the photo. Her thumb had left a faint smudge on the glass where she'd been holding it. After a while, he stood and crossed to the small desk in the corner. He picked up his phone, scrolled to the non-emergency police number, and made the call. His voice stayed calm. Steady as he explained, he'd found a young girl outside the cemetery the night before, that she'd been there for 2 days. The officer on the other end told him they'd send someone within 2 hours. Before hanging up, the voice asked, "Did the child give her name?" Caleb glanced over at Lena. She was watching him now. "Ellie," he said, catching himself. "Lena Brooks." There was a pause. "Any last name?" the officer asked. "Brooks," Caleb repeated. He ended the call and set the phone down. For the rest of the morning, the two of them shared the same room without filling it. Lena sat by the window, knees drawn up, watching a pair of sparrows dart along the fence. Caleb worked through a stack of unopened mail, his eyes flicking toward her every so often. When a knock finally came, she straightened immediately, her grip tightening on the frame. Caleb opened the door to find 2 officers, one older, one younger, standing on the porch. "We receive a report," the older one said. "Yes," Caleb replied. "She was out by Forest Hill Cemetery for 2 nights. The younger officer's gaze flicked past him toward Lena. "Does the girl have any family?" "She said her father was Adam Turner," Caleb said evenly. "He passed away last year. She's been living with her stepmother." The officers exchanged a glance, the younger one jotting something in a small notebook. "She'll need to be placed in temporary care while we verify custody." Caleb felt the cold edge of those words. Temporary care. He'd heard them before, in contexts where they meant anything but care. Lena stood now, the frame hugged tight against her. She stepped toward the officers but stopped in the doorway. Her voice, so soft it almost disappeared into the air. "Please believe me. No matter what anyone says, I'm not lying." Her eyes were steady, not pleading, but filled with that fragile kind of hope that could break with the wrong word. Caleb looked at her, and in that moment he knew. Whatever came next, he wasn't going to walk away. The patrol car's rear door shut with a soft, final click that sounded louder than it should have in the damp morning air. Caleb stood on the porch, his hands still resting on the frame of the screen door, watching the blue and white sedan pull away from the curb. The taillights glowed faintly against the gray daylight before the car turned the corner and vanished. The silence that followed was thick, like the quiet after a shot has been fired and the air hasn't yet remembered how to move. Caleb stayed there until the sound of the engine was gone completely. The only noise left was the faint patter of water dripping from the eaves into the gutter. He stepped back inside, the smell of coffee and wet wool still clinging to the living room. The couch where Lena had slept looked strangely smaller without her there, the indentation in the cushion already beginning to lift. On the table, her empty cocoa mug sat beside a folded paper napkin. For some reason, he didn't move either. A draft crept in through the slightly open window. Caleb crossed the room and shut it, catching a glimpse of his reflection in the glass. Lined face. Eyes rimmed with fatigue, hair damp from the mist outside. He looked like someone who had been up all night, even though he hadn't. On the mantel, his daughter's photograph caught a slant of light through the curtains. He stared at it for a long moment before looking down at the coffee table. There, just where Lena's knees would have been, was the small rectangle of her drawing pad. She must have found it in the bookshelf the night before. He sat and flipped it open. The first page held a single pencil drawing, simple but deliberate. A small figure of a girl stood between 2 adults. One was a man in uniform, his hand resting on the girl's shoulder. The other was a woman in a dress, her face turned away. The lines around the woman's back were darker, almost pressed into the paper, as if the act of drawing them had cost more. Caleb traced the edge of the page with his thumb, careful not to smudge the graphite. He could hear the way she had said it. "I'm not lying." Not as a plea, but as a statement carved out of the last reserves of belief she had in adults. In the kitchen, the wall clock ticked softly. The morning stretched ahead of him, empty but heavy. He poured himself another cup of coffee and drank it standing by the sink, looking out at the thin strip of yard that ran along the side of the house. He thought about calling the police station, asking where they'd taken her, but he already knew the answer. Maple Creek Shelter. The name had come up enough times over the years that it carried its own weight. A place where the halls were too clean, the lighting too flat, and the staff too practiced at avoiding eye contact. Caleb rinsed his mug, set it on the drying rack, and pulled his field jacket from the hook by the door. He slipped the sketch pad into the inside pocket without thinking. The truck started on the first try, the engine coughing once before settling into a low idle. He backed out of the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and turned toward the edge of town. The roads were still wet, a thin film of water glistening under the muted light. He passed the florist's shop, Ruth's blinds were drawn, and then the corner store where he'd stopped the night before. The streets grew quieter as the houses thinned out, replaced by stretches of chain-link fence and vacant lots. Maple Creek sat at the far edge of an industrial park, its beige brick facade doing its best to look unremarkable. The sign out front was chipped, the paint peeling to reveal the metal underneath. A narrow strip of grass ran along the walkway to the main entrance, dotted with stubborn patches of dandelions. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something staler beneath it. A receptionist looked up from behind a laminate counter, her expression the kind Caleb had seen in bureaucratic offices around the world, neutral to the point of erasure. "I'm here to see Lena Brooks," he said. The receptionist's fingers paused over a keyboard. "We've been instructed not to allow you contact," she replied, her voice even. Caleb kept his tone calm. "For her welfare?" "Yes." He leaned in slightly. Was it for her welfare when she sat outside a cemetery for 2 days in the rain? The woman's eyes flickered, but her voice stayed steady. "Unless you have written authorization, you'll need to leave, sir." Caleb didn't argue. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the drawing pad, tearing the page with the sketch of the soldier and the faceless woman. He set it gently on the counter. "Give this to her," he said, without waiting for an answer. He turned and walked back out into the mist. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. In the parking lot, he stood for a moment beside the truck, watching the wind ripple the shallow puddles in the asphalt. Somewhere inside that building was a child who had already learned how to wait in the rain. And now, she was waiting again. He climbed into the driver's seat, the faint graphite smudge still on his thumb from the drawing, and started the engine. The sound filled the cab, but it didn't touch the silence he carried with him as he pulled out onto the road. That evening, Caleb didn't bother turning on the overhead light in the kitchen. The room was dim, lit only by the last thin streaks of daylight slipping past the blinds. He stood at the small table with a manila envelope in front of him, one he hadn't opened in years. It had been tucked in the back of a drawer, beneath a stack of utility bills and an old copy of the town paper. The envelope was from Adam Turner. The handwriting on the front was blocky and deliberate, the kind of script you used when filling out military forms so no one could misread a letter. Caleb had received it 3 weeks before the news of Adam's death, and in the mess that followed, he had never really gone through it. He eased the flap open, the paper giving way with a brittle sound. Inside were several items, stacked neatly. On top was a folded letter in Adam's hand. Beneath it a set of official documents, copies of a life insurance policy and a separate education fund plan in the name of Lena Brooks Turner. The numbers printed in the fund's ledger were substantial, enough to secure a child's schooling for years, maybe longer. The letter was short. "If anything happens to me, make sure my little girl gets the education she deserves. She's tougher than she knows. Keep an eye out, would you?" Caleb let the paper rest on the table. His eyes lingered on the last sentence until the words blurred. He remembered Adam from overseas, not as a close friend, but as a man you could rely on when things got bad. The kind of soldier who never left someone behind. And now his daughter had been left behind twice. Caleb slid the documents back into the envelope and set it aside. He picked up the phone and dialed a number from memory. "Tom," he said when the line clicked. "I need your help." Tom Greer's voice was steady, if a little wary. "What's going on?" "I want to look into the education fund Adam set up for Lena. See who's been moving money, where it went. You think it's gone?" "I think it's not where it's supposed to be." There was a pause, the faint sound of a pencil tapping on Tom's end. "Give me until tomorrow." Caleb hung up, the receiver settling into its cradle with a soft click. He sat back his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Outside, the wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain again. He glanced toward the living room, at the couch where Lena had slept. The coat was still there, folded now, but the space beside it seemed larger than it had when she was in it. For a long moment, he sat in that quiet, the kind that lets thoughts swell until they're too big to ignore. He thought about the way she had said, "Please believe me," and how her eyes hadn't asked for rescue so much as they had asked not to be erased. The next morning came gray and cool. Caleb drove to Tom's garage, the one with the flickering fluorescent over the workbench and the coffee that always tasted faintly of engine oil. Tom was waiting with a folder in hand. "You were right," he said, sliding it across the bench. Inside was a copy of the trust's transaction history. The fund had been opened on May 14th, just months before Adam's death. The guardian listed was Monica Brooks. 6 days after the funeral, the entire balance had been withdrawn. Caleb traced the date with his finger, feeling the heat rise in his chest. Where did it go? Hard to say without more digging. "I was questioned this morning," she said before either man could speak. "They asked if I made the whole thing up. Said maybe I staged it with you." "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "I told them I don't care who you are. I saw you carrying that girl when everyone else turned away." Ruth disappeared into the back room and returned with a small USB stick. "This is for my shop camera. It records all night. You should see it." Back at Tom's garage, they plugged it in. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Timestamp: 11:47 p.m. Rain falling in diagonal lines under the street lamp. An SUV pulling up to the cemetery gate. Monica stepped out, visibly pregnant even under her coat. She opened the rear door, guided Lena out by the arm, and set her down directly in front of the gate. There was a brief exchange, the words lost to the camera, and then Monica turned, climbed back into the driver's seat. Caleb said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. In his chest, the decision had already been made. This wasn't just about getting her out of Maple Creek anymore. It was about making sure she'd never be left at a gate like that again. The footage from Ruth's camera looped again on Tom's old laptop screen. The tiny frame of Lena still fixed under the gate's shadow. Caleb didn't watch it a third time. He stood with his arms folded. But somehow it felt more honest than the official timelines people liked to hand you when they wanted to control the story. "We can't just drop this at the police station," Tom said from behind him. After returning from his second deployment, Jared Collins, an investigative reporter who had a reputation for sticking with the story even after the headlines cooled. Jared had exposed the neglect scandal at a nearby boarding school, and Caleb remembered the way the man had spoken to the victims, quietly, without pushing, as if every answer was on loan and had to be treated with care. Jared was waiting in the lobby, a notepad tucked under his arm, his tie loose at the collar. "You got something for me?" he asked. They watched the footage together. Jared didn't speak until it ended, and even then, his voice was measured. "You're aware this will cause a firestorm?" "That's the point," Caleb said. That evening, within minutes of the segment going live, Caleb's phone began to hum with notifications. Messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years, strangers from towns he'd never visited, all asking the same thing in different words. "What can we do?" But the broadcast didn't just stir support. It rattled the people who had something to lose. Less than an hour after the segment ended, Caleb's phone rang from an unlisted number. "Mr. Warren," the voice said, clipped and cool. "This is Lucinda Marsh, director of Maple Creek." Caleb said nothing. "If you continue to make contact with Lena Brooks, we will be forced to file a restraining order." "You'd better prepare for tonight's headlines," Caleb replied. There was a pause. "What headlines?" "The ones about you agreeing to lock a girl away to keep things quiet." He hadn't recorded anything yet, but he knew the kind of people who blinked when the light turned their way. That night, rain returned in a thin mist, barely enough to bead on the windshield as Caleb drove out to Forest Hill Cemetery. He parked near the gate, headlights off, and stepped into the damp air. The place was empty except for the rows of headstones, their names softened by the dark. He carried a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums Ruth had given him at Adam Turner's grave. He knelt and placed the flowers at the base of the stone. For a moment, he stayed there, head bowed, his palm resting against the cool granite. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said quietly, "but I won't let them bury her a second time." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and the rustle of the old oak near the gate. In the glow of the street lamp, Caleb could almost see the outline of a small figure where Lena had sat those 2 days, knees drawn up, frame in her lap. Only this time, it wasn't a memory. It was a mark. He left the cemetery with the same certainty he'd carried into a patrol briefing overseas, the kind that didn't come from knowing the whole plan, but from knowing the mission was set, but heavy with what they could do. In the corner of the room, his daughter's photograph caught the lamplight, the glass glinting for just a second before the bulb flickered. Caleb leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about strategy or headlines or even the next call to Jared. He was thinking about Lena's voice in his doorway. Steady despite everything, please believe me. And he was thinking about the look in her eyes when she said it, how it wasn't just about the past 2 days, but about a lifetime of being doubted. That, he decided, was something he could carry, and something he could answer. The call came the next morning, before the sun had finished pulling itself over the hills. Caleb was at the kitchen sink, rinsing out his coffee mug, the radio low in the background. Static between stations. He'd been awake for hours. Sleep cut short by the kind of restlessness that made the walls feel closer than they should. The phone's buzz on the counter startled him. Unknown number. He let it ring twice before answering. Mister, and looked around as if deciding whether to stay. I'm listening, Caleb said. I want to represent you pro bono, she continued. No strings. You got a moral case. And now we have something the court can't ignore. Proof of abandonment. If we combine that with Lena's school records, her attendance gaps, he could count those moments on one hand, most of them from his time in the service, when a buddy covered your post so you could eat or toss you a cigarette without asking for one back. You'd need Lena to testify, Martha added. I know that's not easy. She's been telling the truth to people who didn't want to hear it for a long time, Caleb said. Then she'll be ready. Martha replied. I'll draw up the motion. In the meantime, keep her close. The other side might try to discredit both of you before we even get to the courthouse. After they hung up, Caleb stayed by the window, hands braced on the sill. The J was gone. The fog had thinned, but the road past his driveway was still empty. He thought about how battles in court weren't so different from the ones overseas. You still had to pick your ground, you still had to guard your flanks. And there were still people in the distance, hoping you'd run out of breath before you reached them. By noon, he'd driven to Ruth's shop, the little bell above the door greeting him like an old friend. Ruth looked up from trimming stems, her apron dotted with petals and bits of leaf. You look like a man about to jump into deep water, she said. About a lawyer, Caleb told her. Martha Kane. When he left, the evidence sat in a folder on the passenger seat, the manila edges worn soft from handling. The next stop was the elementary school. Miss Parker met him at the door. Her cardigan sleeves pushed up as if she'd been working. In the small faculty lounge, she slid over copies of attendance logs and her own written account of the times Lena had shown up with visible bruises. I can't be there in the courtroom, she said, but my words can. Caleb nodded, folding the pages carefully. They'll be more than enough. Driving home, he felt the folder's weight beside him. It wasn't much, not compared to the kind of operations he'd been part of in the service, but in the quiet fight for a child's safety, it felt like a whole supply line. At the house, the answering machine's red light blinked. 2 new messages. One from Jared, saying the station wanted to run a follow-up. The other from a voice Caleb recognized instantly. Monica, her name restored, the rain finally behind her. The kind of picture you didn't frame. You just carried it, waiting for the day it came true. The envelope came on a Thursday, the kind of pale, brittle morning where frost still clung to the grass long after the sun had made its appearance. Back inside, Lena was still at the kitchen table, sketching. A mug of cocoa had gone lukewarm beside her elbow. She didn't look up when he set the envelope down. He didn't want her to. Not yet. He slid a knife along the flap. The letter was brief, official. Hearing scheduled for the 18th. Petition for emergency custody review. All parties required to appear. Beneath the date. The courtroom number. The name of the presiding judge. The same judge he'd seen in the local paper last winter, smiling stiffly during a charity drive. Lena's pencil scratched softly over paper. She was drawing a fence line, each post slightly crooked, a bit of wire sagging between. Caleb wondered if she was thinking of the cemetery or the chain-link fence behind Monica's house. Everything okay? She asked without looking up. He thought about lying, but the habit had never taken hold between them. Court wants to see us, he said. Her hand paused mid-stroke, the pencil tip hovering. Will they make me go back? No, he said too quickly. Not if we tell them the truth. She went back to the drawing, but slower now, the lines more tentative. By noon, he was on the phone with Martha Kane. She'd already received her own copy of the notice. They're moving fast, she said, which means they're feeling the pressure from public attention. That can work for us, but it can also make them dig in their heels. What do you need from me? Caleb asked. Everything we've collected. And I'll need you to prepare Lena, not to scare her, but so she knows the questions they might ask. These hearings can be intimidating, even for adults. He agreed to meet her at her office the next day. Before hanging up, Martha added, "And Caleb, don't let Monica get to you. If she contacts you, let me know. Don't engage." He didn't mention the message she'd left earlier in the week. It seemed pointless to give her words more air. That afternoon, he took Lena for a walk. They followed the gravel road until it turned to dirt. Past the old grain silos and the stand of cottonwoods where the wind always sounded like a far-off river. She talked about school, how Miss Parker had let her stay in from recess to work on art projects, and he let her words fill the spaces he couldn't. Near the bend in the road, they stopped to watch a pair of deer picking their way through a field. Lena's breath hung in the air. "Do you think," she said quietly, "that they know where they're going?" Caleb kept his eyes on the deer. "Not always. But they keep moving until they find a place that feels right." When they got back, there was a van parked at the edge of the drive. Local news station. Jared climbed out, bundled in a jacket, holding a notebook instead of a camera. "Thought I'd give you a heads up," he said. "They're running a piece on Monday about the hearing. It's fair, as far as I can tell, but Monica's lawyer is talking too. You should expect some spin." Caleb didn't ask what kind. He already knew. That night, after Lena had gone to bed, he sat at the table with the folder open, arranging the papers in the order Martha had suggested. School reports, medical notes, Ruth's witness statement, the USB screenshots. The television in the corner played low, a weather forecast for the weekend, a few headlines about budget cuts in the state legislature. At some point, he realized his coffee had gone cold. The steam long since vanished. He dumped it in the sink, listening to the hollow clink of the mug on porcelain. In the quiet, his thoughts wandered to the days before deployment. How a date on a sheet of paper could change everything. Back then, it had been a flight out. Now, it was a walk into a courthouse. The same undercurrent of inevitability. The same tightness in the chest. Before turning in, he checked on Lena. She was curled on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek. Her hair fanned across the pillow. The sketchpad lay open on the nightstand. The fence she'd drawn was finished now, the last post upright, the wire taut. In the morning, he would drive into town with the folder, meet Martha, and map out the lines they'd hold. For now, he stood there a moment longer, letting the sight of her ease the weight of the envelope still on the kitchen counter, waiting, like so many things, for the day they'd face it together. The morning of the hearing broke cold and pale, as if the sun had overslept and was in no hurry to make up for lost time. Caleb was awake before the first blush of light. The old habit of early rising from his service years refusing to let him sleep in. The house was still, the kind of stillness that carries a weight of expectation. He moved quietly through the kitchen, careful not to wake Lena. The coffee maker's low hum was the only sound. Outside the window, frost had painted the yard in delicate silver, and a thin mist lingered over the tree line. It felt like the sort of day where breath and thought alike would turn visible in the air. He laid his suit jacket over the back of a chair and ran a cloth over the shoes he hadn't worn since a funeral. They were scuffed, the leather dull, but they'd have to do. Court wasn't about appearance, Martha had said. It was about presence, being steady, measured. But Caleb knew that the first glance a judge took could still plant seeds. Upstairs, the floor creaked under small feet. Lena appeared in the doorway, holding her dress shoes in one hand. Her hair was slightly tangled from sleep. They ate together without much talk. A slice of toast for him, a bowl of cereal for her. She picked at it more than she ate, eyes drifting to the folder on the counter. Inside, their defense, pages of school notes, photographs, Ruth's sworn statement, sat ready. When it was time to leave, he helped her with the coat, pulling the collar snug around her neck. The drive into town was longer than usual, the road seeming to stretch between one breath and the next. Bare trees stood along the shoulder like watchmen, and every mile brought more traffic, cars heading the same way, some likely bound for the same building. The courthouse stood at the edge of the square, its brickwork darkened by decades of rain and winter winds. A flag lifted lazily above the entrance. The steps were already dotted with people, lawyers juggling briefcases, a man in a ball cap holding a coffee, a pair of women in heavy coats speaking in low, urgent tones. Martha was waiting just inside the door, her hair pulled back, glasses catching the overhead light. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't stay home," Caleb replied. She glanced at Lena and smiled softly. "We'll keep this as short for her as we can." They passed through security, the metallic clink of the scanner briefly breaking the solemn air. On the second floor, outside courtroom B, the hallway was a current of muted conversations. Caleb caught sight of Monica at the far end, flanked by her lawyer, a tall man with a portfolio under one arm. Monica wore a dark coat, her hair perfect, eyes unreadable. She didn't look at him. Martha steered them to a bench near the doors. "Remember," she told Caleb quietly, "we let the evidence speak first. If they try to provoke you, don't bite." Lena sat between them, her feet not quite touching the floor. She traced a small pattern on the bench with her fingertip, over and over, as though to keep her hands steady. When the bailiff called their case, they stepped into the courtroom. It smelled faintly of old wood and paper. The judge's bench loomed at the far end, backed by the state seal and flanked by flags. Rows of pew-like benches held a scattering of observers, Jared among them, his notepad ready. The judge, a woman with silver hair pulled tight at the nape, looked over her glasses at the file before her. "This is the matter of Lena Brooks. Petition for emergency custody review. Parties present." Martha answered for them, her voice steady, carrying without sharpness. Monica's lawyer did the same. The judge nodded. "We'll begin with statements." Martha started, laying out the bones of their case, the abandonment at the cemetery, the witness testimony, the inconsistencies in Monica's account. She spoke without embellishment, letting the facts find their own weight. Caleb watched Lena from the corner of his eye. She sat very still, eyes fixed on a point just above the judge's shoulder. When it was Monica's turn, her lawyer painted a picture of misunderstanding, of a child left briefly in the care of a family friend, of rumors spun out of proportion. He mentioned Caleb's military service, but not as praise, more as a suggestion that perhaps the years away had left him unfit for delicate, ongoing parental responsibility. Caleb felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his jaw locked. The judge called for the first witness, Ruth. The older woman walked to the stand, her hands folded over each other, her voice clear as she recounted finding Lena in the rain. The hours she had waited, the absence of anyone coming for her. Monica's lawyer tried to chip at the details, but Ruth did not waver. Next came the school counselor, then Miss Parker, each adding quiet brushstrokes to the same picture, a child adrift, patterns of neglect. By the time the judge recessed for lunch, the air in the room felt heavier. Caleb stepped outside with Lena, letting the cold wind scrape the courtroom's smell from their skin. She leaned against him, not saying anything, and he was grateful for the silence. Back inside, the afternoon would bring their turn with the USB evidence, the drone recording, the financial records. But for now, they sat on the courthouse steps, sharing an apple from his coat pocket, watching the traffic circle the square. "Feels like forever," Lena murmured. He nodded. "Some things take time, but we're getting there." And as the wind tugged at their coats, the courtroom air felt denser when they reconvened after lunch, as though the walls had drawn closer during the break. Caleb sat at the table beside Martha, his shoulders square but heavy, his eyes steady on the judge. Across the aisle, Monica adjusted her coat before settling in, her lawyer leaning in to murmur something she answered with the faintest nod. Martha rose, a slim USB drive in her hand. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to enter into evidence an unaltered video recording taken from a street-facing security camera, timestamped the morning of March 14th. The judge gestured for her to proceed. The bailiff crossed the room, took the drive, and carried it to the clerk. A few keystrokes later, the screen mounted on the wall behind the judge flickered to life. Caleb kept his gaze forward, though his hands tightened around each other under the table. The footage began with a grainy view of the cemetery gate, rain coming down in thin, slanted lines. A small figure appeared from the right, Lena, coat hood up, clutching the picture frame to her chest. She stepped through the gate and sat on the bench just inside, her legs barely reaching the edge. Minutes passed. Cars went by. No one approached. Then, another figure entered the frame, a woman in a dark coat, umbrella low over her face. She walked to the bench, leaned down, said something to Lena. Without touching her, she turned and left. Her pace unhurried. The girls stayed. When the screen went black, silence filled the room. The sound of the rain in that recording seemed to linger in Caleb's ears. Monica's lawyer stood. That's circumstantial. The woman's identity. The witness will testify. Martha cut in, calm but firm. They called Ruth to the stand again, this time to confirm the woman in the footage was Monica. She did so without hesitation. Next came the drone recording. Caleb had only listened to it once before, late at night when Harris first brought it over, but now every word returned to him. On the screen, the drone's camera hovered over the parking lot of a roadside cafe. Two people emerged, Monica and a man Caleb didn't know. Their voices, caught by the device's directional mic, were clipped but clear. She won't talk. She knows better. Still, leaving her there? Someone's going to notice. They'll think it's him, Monica said. They always do. Martha let the words hang in the air, then stopped the recording. Your Honor, we believe this, combined with financial records obtained through subpoena, demonstrates both intent and motive. She produced a stack of papers, the top page marked with highlighted withdrawals from a fund labeled Lena Brooks Education Trust. Over the past year, the account had been nearly drained. The signatures on the authorization matched Monica's. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes moving between the exhibits and the faces before her. Caleb could feel the shift, like a current turning beneath the surface of the water. Monica's lawyer objected, claiming misinterpretation, insisting the withdrawals were for legitimate expenses. But the dates, amounts, and corresponding personal purchases painted a picture that needed no added color. The last piece came from Jared, the reporter. He testified about the video clip that had circulated online, the one cut to make it seem Caleb had been aggressive with Monica. He traced the upload back to an account linked to the same man in the drone footage. When the judge called for closing statements, Martha didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace or point. She simply gathered the threads. Lena alone in the rain, Monica walking away, the financial exploitation, the deliberate framing. She spoke of stability, of the right to be safe, of the harm done when the people entrusted with care choose instead to abandon. Caleb didn't look at Monica as Martha spoke. He kept his eyes on Lena, who sat at the witness table now. Her small hands folded, her posture straight. She wasn't looking at anyone in particular, just ahead, as if she could see past the bench, the gallery, the walls, into a place that might one day feel like home. When the judge adjourned for deliberation, the air in the room seemed to loosen, though no one spoke. Caleb and Lena stepped into the hallway, finding the same bench they'd sat on that morning. She leaned into him this time, resting her head against his arm. It's almost over, he said quietly. She didn't answer right away, just watched the people moving through the corridor. Finally, she nodded. I know. They stayed like that until the bailiff's voice carried down the hall, calling them back inside. The verdict would come next. But for that moment, those few measured breaths, Caleb let himself feel the weight shift from dread to the edge of something else. Not relief, not yet, but close enough to reach for. When they were called back into the courtroom, the hush felt heavier than before, like the air in an old church just before the first note of an organ breaks the silence. The judge's voice was measured, explaining that before the verdict, she would hear directly from Lena. Caleb's eyes went to her instantly. She was still in her chair at the side, small against the wide bench, her feet not quite touching the floor. Martha bent down, whispered something close to her ear, and Lena nodded, clutching the picture frame she'd brought since that first day. The glass caught the overhead lights for a second, reflecting a dull glow, then settled back into her lap. The bailiff led her gently toward the witness stand. She moved with that quiet, deliberate care Caleb had come to recognize, like someone who knew every pair of eyes in the room might be waiting for her to stumble. Do you understand you have to tell the truth? The judge asked. Lena's voice was soft. Yes, ma'am. She took her seat, the microphone angled down to meet her. For a moment, she just looked at her hands, thumbs touching, then apart, then touching again. Lena, Martha began, her tone warm but not coaxing. Can you tell the court what happened the day you were at the cemetery? The girl's gaze lifted slightly, not toward Martha, but toward the far wall. It was raining. I didn't have anywhere else to go. Her words were even, almost too even. I want to see my dad. She tapped the frame lightly, the sound barely there. And who is your dad? He's in the picture. A pause. He's dead. The room seemed to hold that stillness a beat too long. Caleb's chest tightened, not from surprise, but from hearing it spoken aloud in her own voice. "Why were you there alone?" Martha asked. Lena swallowed, her throat moving slowly. "Monica dropped me off. She said she'd be back after a meeting." But her eyes shifted down again. "She didn't come back." Martha kept her voice steady. "Did she tell you why she left you there?" "No, just that I should wait." Had something like that ever happened before? Another pause, and Lena's shoulders lifted in a slight, resigned shrug. "Sometimes. Different places. I don't ask anymore." From the corner of his eye, Caleb saw Monica stiffen in her chair, her lawyer whispering quickly. Martha took a small step closer to the stand. "When Mr. Warren found you, what did you think?" Lena hesitated this time, her fingers tightening around the picture frame. "I thought maybe he wouldn't leave." She looked up then, straight at Caleb. The flicker of something, hope, fear, both tangled, crossed her face. And he didn't. For the first time, a faint ripple of sound moved through the courtroom. Not words, just the sound people make when a truth lands somewhere deep. Martha gave her a moment before asking the next question. "Do you want to live with Mr. Warren?" "Yes." The word was immediate, unshaken. "Can you tell us why?" Lena's lips pressed together. "He listens," she said finally. "Not just what I say, to the quiet parts too." Caleb felt the weight of that land inside him like a stone in water. No splash, just the deep pull of it sinking all the way down. Martha glanced toward the judge. No further questions. The opposing counsel rose, his expression careful, voice pitched to sound gentle. "Lena, you understand Monica is married to your father?" She nodded. "And she's cared for you since he passed." Another nod. "So you know she loves you." Lena's small fingers traced the edge of the frame. "She loves her life," she said. "I just don't fit in it." The lawyer hesitated, then looked toward Monica before sitting down. "No more questions." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Lena, thank you for speaking today. You may step down." As she left the stand, Caleb stood without thinking, meeting her halfway. She placed the picture frame in his hands for a moment, almost like passing something sacred across a threshold. Then she took it back, holding it close again. They sat together through the judge's closing remarks, the words blurring into a rhythm Caleb didn't try to follow until he heard the decision. Temporary custody granted to Caleb Warren, pending a review in 6 months. It wasn't forever, but it was now, and sometimes now was the only thing you could hold without it slipping away. Outside, on the courthouse steps, the cold hit them like a fresh start and an unfinished story all at once. The street was wet from an earlier drizzle, light glancing off the pavement. Lena took his hand, not tightly, just enough to let him know she was there. "Can we go home?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, we can." They began down the steps, side by side, into a world that wasn't fixed, but maybe, just maybe, could be rebuilt one careful step at a time. The first night, neither of them spoke much. Caleb had prepared the small bedroom down the hall in the way he thought a child might like. Fresh sheets with a pale blueprint, a lamp with a soft shade. The window cracked just enough to let the cool air drift in. But when Lena stood in the doorway, her backpack hanging off one shoulder, she didn't move right away. She just looked inside, her eyes moving from the bed to the dresser to the single picture frame he'd set on the nightstand, an old photograph of the pier at Cedar Bluff, the place he always went when he needed to think. "You can move things around," he said after a pause. "It's your space now." She nodded, stepped in, and set her bag on the bed. The sound of the zipper opening was louder than anything else in the room. She took out the framed picture of her father and set it on the dresser without a word. Then, without looking back, she sat on the bed's edge, her feet swinging slightly above the floor. Down the hall, Caleb busied himself in the kitchen, not because there was much to do, but because the silence felt too heavy to stand still in. He reheated some leftover chicken stew, the smell filling the small house with something warm, something that didn't feel like courtrooms or rainy graveyards. When he called her to the table, she came quietly, sitting with her hands folded in her lap until he slid the bowl toward her. She picked up the spoon, tasted it, and kept eating without saying much. He didn't press her. He knew that some silences were like frost. You had to let them melt on their own. Later, when it was time for bed, he knocked softly on her door. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed, sketching something in a notebook. She quickly closed it when she saw him. "Need anything?" he asked. She shook her head. "All right, light's there if you want it on." "Okay." He left the door slightly open, a thin strip of hallway light falling across the floor. For hours after, he lay in his own bed, listening, not in the way soldiers listen for danger, but in the way you listen for another person breathing, for signs they're settling into a place they're not sure is safe yet. By morning, she was already in the kitchen when he came out, sitting at the table with a piece of toast. She'd found the bread and the peanut butter without asking. Her hair was pulled back into a loose braid, probably done in front of the bathroom mirror. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she replied, barely above a whisper. The next few days unfolded slowly. Kayla made a point to keep the house steady. No sudden changes, no visitors dropping by unannounced. They went grocery shopping together, her small steps keeping pace with his in the aisle. At the hardware store, she lingered by the paint samples, running her fingers over the color cards. "Thinking about painting your room?" he asked. She shrugged. "Maybe." One afternoon, he found her in the backyard, sitting on the low wooden step with Murphy, the old dog, lying at her feet. She was drawing again, this time, the outline of the house, but with flowers along the front porch that weren't really there. "You like flowers?" She nodded, still sketching. "We could plant some in spring." Her pencil paused. "We?" "Yeah, if you want." It wasn't a promise wrapped in big words, just an offering left there for her to pick up if she felt like it. At night, she began leaving her door open a little wider. Caleb noticed, but didn't mention it. He kept to his routine, checking the locks, turning off the porch light, making sure Murphy was inside. Every so often, he'd hear the faint scratch of her pencil before the house went quiet. The lonesome feeling he'd carried for years, through deployments, through empty houses, was still there, but it had shifted. It wasn't the same sharp edge. Now it felt like a space waiting to be filled, and he wasn't the only one who might fill it. On the fifth night, as he passed her room, she looked up from her sketchbook. "Good night, Caleb," she said. It was the first time she'd said his name. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, then nodded. "Good night, Lena." In that small exchange, something changed. Not in a way either of them could explain, but enough for him to feel it settle in the air. And as he turned off the hall light, he realized that for the first time in a long while, he wasn't just living in his house. Someone else was beginning to live there too. It started small, almost quietly, the way late winter wind drifts in under a door you thought was shut tight. A local paper ran a 2-paragraph piece about the custody hearing. No names, just a decorated veteran and a young girl found outside a cemetery. It should have ended there, tucked between ad for used trucks and a notice about the library's new hours. But a week later, Caleb noticed a white sedan parked across the street, while he and Lena were loading groceries into the truck. The driver, a man with a camera slung over his shoulder, didn't get out, just sat there, his lens angled toward them through the half-lowered window. Lena froze mid-step, her hand still holding a paper bag. Caleb touched her shoulder lightly, took the bag from her, and opened the truck door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of sawdust and Murphy's fur. He started the engine without a word, the gravel crunching under the tires as they pulled away. In the rearview mirror, the sedan stayed put. By the time they got home, 2 more vehicles were idling along the curb, one with the logo of a regional TV station. A woman in a dark coat stepped out, her heels sinking slightly into the soft dirt by the roadside. "Mr. Warren?" she called. He didn't answer. He took the groceries inside, closed the door, and drew the curtain halfway, not shut, just enough to break the direct view. From the kitchen window, he could see her speaking into a microphone while a cameraman adjusted his focus. Lena stood at the counter, unpacking a carton of eggs. "Why are they here?" she asked, her voice quiet but edged. "They'll get bored if we don't give them anything," he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. The kind of people who stood in the rain outside courthouses didn't leave, because you kept the blinds drawn. Over the next few days, the small town's usual rhythm began to feel tilted. At the diner, Caleb noticed conversations cut short when he walked in. 2 old men at the corner booth whispered over their coffee. A woman at the grocery store smiled too wide and asked too many questions about Lena's adjustment. It wasn't all bad. Harris, his friend from the service, stopped by one afternoon with a bag of seed for the backyard. "Figured you might want to keep her busy planting when spring comes," he said, nodding toward Lena, who was at the table sketching. The gesture wasn't loud or performative, and that made it worth more. Still, the tension simmered. One evening, Caleb found an anonymous letter shoved under his front door, a single sheet of paper with the words, "Think you can hide the truth?" typed in block letters. No return address, no signature. He folded it twice and put it in the drawer with the others. The legal notices, the custody forms, the printouts of financial statements. The media didn't just hover on the street anymore. Caleb deleted it. But the part that gnawed at him most wasn't the cameras. It was the way Lena had started to glance toward the window before crossing the living room. The way she would linger in the hallway before going outside. One Saturday morning, they tried to visit the pier. It was cold. The kind of day when the water looked like steel and the gulls' cries felt sharper in the air. They had only been there 10 minutes when Caleb noticed a woman crouched low near the boardwalk rail, snapping photos with a long lens. Lena noticed too. Her hand tightened around the sleeve of his jacket. "Let's head back," he said softly. On the drive home, she stared out the passenger side window, her reflection faint in the glass. By Monday, the school called. Miss Parker explained that a reporter had tried to speak to Lena during recess, standing just beyond the fence. They'd moved the children inside, but the damage was done. Caleb's jaw tightened. That night, after Lena went to bed, he sat on the porch with the lights off. The street was quiet, but he knew eyes could be on them even in the stillness. He thought about the war, how sometimes the hardest part wasn't the fighting, but the constant sense of being watched, of never being entirely safe. The difference now was that safety wasn't just for him. He leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and tried to picture what the coming months might hold. Court dates, headlines, neighbors picking sides. He wasn't naive enough to think it would fade overnight. But inside, down the hall, there was a girl sleeping in a bed she'd begun to make her own, with a lamp she sometimes left on low. And for now, that was enough to keep him sitting there, watching the street, until the last bit of night air grew too cold to stand. It was a Tuesday morning that smelled faintly of damp earth and coffee grounds. Overnight rain had left the pavement slick, reflecting the thin light of a sun that seemed reluctant to fully show itself. Caleb had just finished sanding the edge of a shelf he was building for Lena's room when he heard the knock. 3 soft raps, not hurried, not tentative either. When he opened the door, Baruth stood there in her Old Navy raincoat, the collar turned up. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers curled around something small. "Can I come in?" she asked, though she was already stepping forward as if she knew he'd say yes. Inside, Murphy ambled over to sniff her boots, tail swishing once. She glanced toward the kitchen, where Lena's laughter drifted from a cereal bowl and a comic book. Then she turned back to Caleb and pressed the object into his palm. It was a USB drive, the kind you might pick up free at a county fair, except this one was wrapped in a square of cloth, folded tight. "You should see what's on it," she said, but maybe not with her in the room. Her voice had the low weight of someone who'd rehearsed the sentence, not for drama, but to make sure it landed clean. Caleb closed his fingers around the small, warm bundle. "Where did you get it?" She shook her head. Later, they moved to the porch. The boards were still damp under their boots, the air holding that quiet after-rain scent. Baruth settled into the chair nearest the railing, her gaze drifting to the street before coming back to him. "I didn't mean to get involved," she began, pulling at a loose thread on her cuff. "But you've seen them. Reporters. People talking. And I've seen Monica too. I've seen more than she thinks I have." The cloth in his hand seemed heavier now. "She came to the cemetery once. After the night you found Lena," Ruth said. "Didn't know I was there. She left in a hurry when she spotted me. That got me curious. So I checked the old security feed from the florist shop." Ruth owned the little flower stand just across from the cemetery gates, a narrow wooden hut painted green, with a single camera mounted above the cash register for security, plus some from the week before, her meeting with a man outside the hardware store. The same man who's been hanging around the courthouse lately. Caleb's grip tightened. He felt the grooves in the plastic casing press into his skin. "I figured you'd know what to do with it," she said. "I'm not much for courts or lawyers, but I know truth when I see it. And I can't sit by while people twist it into something else." From inside, the sound of Lena's cereal spoon clinking against the bowl drifted out through the open window. "And watch yourself. People don't like being cornered." After she left, Caleb stayed on the porch a while, the USB still in his hand. Across the street, the white sedan from last week idled, its exhaust curling into the cool air. He didn't need to check to know there'd be eyes behind the tinted glass. When he finally went inside, Lena had moved to the living room, curled up with Murphy on the couch. "Is it still raining?" she asked. "Not anymore," he said, "but the ground's still wet." He slipped the USB into the inside pocket of his jacket, buttoned the flap. and sat down across from her. The room was warm, smelling faintly of the pine boards he'd been sanding earlier. That night, after Lena went to bed, he booted up the old laptop on the kitchen table. The screen glowed in the dim light, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. He slid the USB in. It took a moment for the files to load. Then, there it was, grainy footage from the cemetery gate, time-stamped 7:43 p.m. rain falling in silver streaks under the street lamp. Monica's figure emerging from the shadows, Lena's small frame beside her. They stopped at the gate. Monica bent down, said something, her lips barely moving, then turned and walked away. Lena stayed there, clutching something to her chest. The clip ended. Caleb leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. He stared at the blank wall across the table, not moving to play the second file just yet. His hands were steady, but something in his chest had shifted, like a gear catching in a machine that had been running too long without oil. He closed the laptop without saving anything to the hard drive, pulled the USB out, and slipped it back into the cloth. Tomorrow, he'd figure out the next step. For now, the sound of Lena's slow breathing down the hall was enough to anchor him. Outside, rain began again, soft, like it didn't want to wake the street. The call came just after dawn, when the first gray light was stretching across the street, painting the wet pavement in a dull sheen. Caleb had been up since before the alarm, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, the USB drive wrapped in its cloth beside him. The phone buzzed against the wood, vibrating like it had something urgent to say. Yeah. Caleb's voice was low, rough from the long night. "It's Harris," came the reply, the deep, measured tone of a man who rarely wasted words. "You sitting down?" Caleb's eyes drifted to the clock above the sink. 6:12 a.m. Lena was still asleep, her small frame curled beneath the quilt in the next room. "I'm already there," he said. "I've been digging," Harris continued, "into the education fund Monica set up for Lena a couple years back. The one Franklin Dawson's name is also on." Caleb straightened in his chair. He'd heard about the fund in passing. One of those details Marianne's father had used to boast about his family's responsibility during the custody disputes. "There's not a cent left," Harris said. "It's empty. Cleared out 6 weeks before you found Lena at the cemetery." The words sat heavy in the air. Caleb stared at the grain in the table, tracing one dark line with his fingertip. "Where did it go?" "That's the part that's interesting," Harris said. He sounded almost reluctant, like he was pushing Caleb towards something he didn't want to see. "Transfers went through a shell account under an LLC that doesn't exist anymore. From there, it moved to a joint account with Monica's name and another, same guy Ruth caught on that floor's camera." Caleb's mind flicked back to the blurry figure outside the hardware store, the one leaning close to Monica as the rain blurred the edges of their silhouettes. "You have proof?" "I have copies of the bank statements," Harris said. "And, Caleb, it's not just the fund. They siphoned from a stipend Franklin's trust pays out for her care. That's supposed to cover schooling. Clothes, health care. Gone." Caleb closed his eyes. He pictured Lena's shoes, soles worn almost smooth. The thin jacket she'd been wearing that night in the rain. The one that hung loose around her shoulders. "I'll bring you the files," Harris added. "But we need to move quiet. If they catch wind." A floorboard creaked down the hall. Caleb glanced toward the doorway as Lena appeared, rubbing her eyes, hair tangled from sleep. She padded into the kitchen and climbed onto the chair across from him. "Morning," she murmured, looking toward the window where the light was starting to soften the edges of the rain clouds. Caleb reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Morning, kiddo." He covered the USB with his palm, sliding it toward his jacket pocket. "Hungry?" She nodded, and he rose to pour cereal. The normal rhythm of morning threading itself over the conversation's sharp edges. Harris stayed on the line, silent now, waiting. "I'll call you back," Caleb said quietly into the phone, ending the call before Lena could ask questions. By mid-morning, Harris arrived. He didn't come to the front door. Caleb found him in the garage, leaning against the workbench, a manila envelope in his hands. His jacket smelled faintly of motor oil and rain. "Here," Harris said, handing it over. Inside were photocopies, account statements, transfer logs, even a handwritten ledger page in Monica's looping script. Each page was a breadcrumb leading through a trail of greed that was almost careful enough to be clever. Caleb set the pages out on the workbench, side by side. Numbers lined up with dates he remembered, days when Lena had come home from school without lunch money. Or when Monica claimed there was no budget for new clothes. They thought you'd never see this, Harris said. And they sure as hell didn't expect anyone like me to go looking. Outside, a car door slammed, sharp in the still air. Both men froze, listening. A moment later, the sound of tires rolling away eased the tension, but only slightly. Caleb gathered the papers into a neat stack. We're going to need more than this, he said. If this goes to court, they'll spin it. Say I forged it, or you hacked it. Harris nodded slowly. I've got a friend, used to work compliance for the bank. She might certify the records, make them bulletproof. Caleb's gaze drifted toward the closed garage door, the faint light bleeding in through the cracks. Do it, quietly. Harris tapped the top of the envelope. And, Caleb, this isn't just about money. If they took this from her, they'll take whatever else they can. That kid needs someone watching every move they make. Caleb didn't answer right away. His hands rested on the wood, palms flat, feeling the cool grain under his skin. Somewhere inside him, the familiar weight of duty shifted, no longer the kind forged in the noise and dust of deployment, but the kind that takes root in kitchens and garages and quiet streets, where harm wears a friendlier face. When Harris left, Caleb stood alone in the garage, the envelope under his arm. He thought of Ruth's USB, now tucked in the same locked drawer as these papers. Two pieces of a puzzle that, when fit together, would tell a story too ugly for anyone to look away from. From the kitchen came the sound of Lena humming, soft, off-key, but steady. It was enough to make him breathe deeper, to remind him why this fight mattered. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was slipping through the clouds in thin, stubborn beams. Caleb pulled open the garage door and let the light in. It fell across the papers like a quiet promise. Whatever had been taken, they'd find a way to get it back. It was Ruth's idea, though she never quite admitted it that way. One afternoon, she stopped by the garage with a paper bag of scones and a second-hand cardboard box that rattled faintly when she set it down on the workbench. Found this in my nephew's old things, she said, dusting flour from her palms. Kid was obsessed with drones. Flew them over the river until the sheriff told him to knock it off. Anyway, figured you might have a use for it. Inside the box was a small quadcopter scuffed around the edges, with a camera no bigger than a dime. Caleb lifted it carefully, testing the weight in his hand. The battery pack slid into place with a soft click. You think this'll work? He asked. Ruth's mouth pulled into something between a smile and a grimace. I think if they're meeting out back like Harris says, you might see what you need to see. That night, Harris called from his truck. Monica's got a standing Thursday with her social services liaison, guy named Whitlock. They meet at that little cafe behind the post office, then walk down the alley toward her building. Always the same time, give or take. Caleb checked the clock. 2 hours. Enough to get in place. By the time the sun dipped low, the drone was humming softly in the cool evening air, rising above the narrow alley that ran between Monica's apartment building and the row of storage units. From above, the cracked pavement looked like a dark seam stitched between bricks. Caleb stood in the shadows behind the florist's shop, the controller steady in his hands. The video feed streamed to his phone, jerky at first, then smoothing out as the drone settled into a hover just beyond the edge of the streetlight's reach. They appeared on schedule. Monica, in her tailored coat, her hair pinned, just so, walking beside a man in a gray suit with the kind of easy posture that comes from thinking no one's watching. The drone mic was small, temperamental. It caught the scrape of their shoes, the rustle of fabric, the sharp exhale of a laugh. Then words. Told you by the time the hearing comes, he won't have a leg to stand on, Whitlock said. His voice carried a note of boredom, like this was all routine. Monica's reply was clipped, almost rehearsed. It's not enough to win. I need him humiliated. He thinks bringing her into court is going to make people pity him. We'll show them she's better off without him. Caleb's grip on the controller tightened. He kept the drone still, the little machine hovering like a patient insect above their path. Whitlock chuckled. And the fund? No one's connecting that to you. Paper trail's clean. Good, Monica said, because if he starts digging there, I want you to make sure the school misplaces a few more records. We need her to look unstable. That way, if anyone asks why she was out there that night, it's just another example. They turned toward the back entrance of her building. The drone drifted forward, its lens catching the way Monica's mouth tightened. Not in fear, but in calculation. Whitlock lowered his voice, but the mic still caught it. Don't worry. By the time we're done, he'll wish he'd never come back. The rest of their words were muffled by the slam of the door. Caleb let the drone hover a moment longer, then guided it up and away into the darker stretch of sky. Back in the garage, Harris leaned over the phone screen as they replayed the footage. The voices were clear enough. Each phrase was a nail in a coffin Monica had built with her own hands. This, Harris said, tapping the screen, isn't just bad optics. This is conspiracy, obstruction. If the judge hears this alongside the fund records, he let the thought hang. Caleb shut the drone down, the little hum fading into the quiet. He looked toward the closed door to the kitchen, where a strip of warm light cut across the floor. Lena was in there, drawing at the table. Her world, what little stability she had, rested on whether they could turn these recordings into something undeniable. Ruth, who had stayed in the corner sipping tea, finally spoke. You're not just fighting for her, Caleb. You're fighting so she knows someone's willing to stand in the rain for her, same way you did that night. Caleb nodded, not trusting himself to answer. The recording was still playing on a loop in his mind. Monica's voice, so composed, so sure she'd already won. He reached for the small lockbox in the workbench drawer. Inside, alongside the USB from Ruth and the bank documents from Harris, he placed the memory card from the drone. 3 pieces now, enough to start a story in court that wouldn't be so easy to rewrite. When he finally stepped outside, the night had deepened. A thin crescent moon hung above the rooftops, and somewhere down the block a dog barked once, then went quiet. Caleb stood there for a long moment, letting the cool air fill his lungs. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was about to get louder. But in the pocket of his jacket, he carried the sound of their own voices, and with it, a promise. The truth had a way of cutting through the dark. The next Thursday came with a brittle kind of cold, the kind that made metal groan in the night and left frost tracing the edges of windows. Caleb had been up since before dawn, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug that had long since gone lukewarm. The memory card from last week's recording sat beside it, a silent weight in a small plastic case. Harris's text came just after 7. Same place, same time. But tonight, she's meeting someone else. By late afternoon, the sky had dulled to a flat gray. Caleb took the long way around town, avoiding the main road, until he parked behind the abandoned feed store. The drone was already prepped, its battery charged, its camera lens wiped clean. He checked the controller, then the mic, still temperamental, but Harris had given it a tweak that should cut some of the background hiss. He launched it just before Monica appeared. This time, she wasn't with Whitlock. Instead, a tall man in a dark overcoat fell in his step beside her, his hand finding the small of her back in a way that spoke of familiarity. They didn't linger near the cafe. They went straight for the alley that led to her building. From above, the drone followed them past a row of dumpsters and into the narrow space where light barely reached. The man leaned close, speaking low, but the mic caught enough. It's all set for Monday. He murmured. The notice is official, judge's seal, and everything. He'll get it that morning. Monica's voice had that same cool precision Caleb remembered from the week before. Good. I want him rattled before the hearing even starts. Make it clear we're not bluffing. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope, even from the drone's vantage point. The seal was visible, a heavy embossed crest that could only have come from the courthouse. Monica slid it into her bag without even glancing inside. They paused near the service door, the man glancing upward as though checking for eyes in the windows above. Caleb held his breath, keeping the drone still in the thin sliver of sky between 2 brick walls. Once he gets this, the man continued, he'll know we can drag him into a separate suit if we want. Custody's one thing, but we can make the property a nightmare too. Monica smiled faintly. Let him drown in the paperwork. By the time he figures out where to swim, it'll be too late. They moved inside, the door swinging shut with a heavy thud. Caleb let the drone drift higher, catching one last frame. Monica, head tilted toward the man, her hand resting lightly on his arm as if sealing an agreement. When he brought the drone back down, Harris was already waiting in the truck. They replayed the footage on the small screen between them, the courthouse seal glaring under the alley's dim light. This, Harris said, isn't just talk. It's intimidation. That envelope proves they're playing angles outside the custody case. Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the pause frame, the handoff, the smile, the envelope disappearing into her bag. It wasn't anger he felt now, not exactly. More like a slow, steady resolve hardening inside him. By the time he locked the footage in the same box as the other evidence, the night had deepened into full dark. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere, down the block. Lena was already asleep when he stepped inside, her drawing from earlier, a house with a wide porch and a small figure at the gate, resting on the table. He studied it for a moment before turning out the light. There was still a long road ahead, but now, piece by piece, he was gathering something that couldn't be denied. And soon, they have to hear it. The day Lena moved in, the house smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh paint. Caleb had stayed up late the night before, sanding the edges of the old desk that had once belonged to his daughter Emily, the one who had never grown past 7. He had found the desk in the attic months ago, covered in dust, its drawers swollen shut. Now it stood beneath the window, sunlight pooling across its surface like warm water. The room was a soft, quiet blue, Lena's choice. She had pointed to the paint sample without a word, and he had known. Not the pale sky blue you find in catalogs, but something deeper, like the shade the sky takes on just before the first hint of night. The kind of blue that makes you pause. Her boxes were small, clothes neatly folded, a shoebox filled with pencils and scraps of paper, a handful of books worn thin at the edges. She placed them one by one on the desk, as though each object had a weight it needed to remember before it could rest there. Murphy, the old hound, sat in the hallway, his chin on his paws, watching. Caleb didn't hover. He made coffee instead, the smell drifting down the hall. In the kitchen, the radio hummed low, some old country song about roads and leaving. The front door stayed open, and the sound of rain tapping on the porch roof came in like someone breathing slow. When he passed by her door again, Lena was sitting at the desk, not unpacking anymore. She was writing, her hand small but steady, head bent close to the paper. The house felt different, as though it were holding its breath. Later, he found the paper she had left on the desk, a single line written in pencil. I want to have a last name Warren. The words were simple, but something in them was heavier than the years between them. He stood there for a long time, the room quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. He didn't rush to answer her. Some things didn't need an answer right away. He only straightened the paper so it lay flat, smoothing its corner, and left it where she had placed it, like a promise neither of them needed to say aloud. That night, he found her asleep under the quilt Emily's grandmother had made decades ago. The blue walls held the light of the lamp in a way that felt warm, almost protective. He turned the lamp down low, sat for a while in the doorway, and listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Outside, the rain went on, patient and unhurried, as if it knew there was no need to stop. By late afternoon, the rain had forgotten how to fall hard. It drifted instead, a fine spring sift that kept the porch planks dark and glossy. Caleb had left the door open to let the damp sweetness in, the smell of thawed earth, of pine, of something green pushing itself up through last year's leaves. The house held the scent like a memory it wanted to keep. He'd hung the new sign at noon, a square of plain cedar he'd sanded smooth by hand. The letters were careful, not perfect, worn home. He'd traced them in pencil first, went over them with a small brush, then rubbed oil into the grain until the wood drank it down and glowed. When he stepped back, it didn't look like a claim. It looked like a promise. Lena came to the doorway in wool socks. The hems of her jeans rolled twice. She touched the frame of the door as she passed, then sat on the top step and pulled her knees close, chins settled on their bony caps. Murphy sprawled at her feet like a collapsed tent, ears twitching at nothing in particular. Across the road, water beaded along the telephone wire, each drop fattening until it let go and fell. They didn't talk. There was nothing that needed the weight of words. The world made small sounds that were enough. The ticking drip from the porch roof, the breath of the dog. A far-off truck shifting gears on the hill. Somewhere behind them, a kettle came to the edge of a whistle and then thought better of it. Caleb sat beside her. His hands were nicked from the week's work. Sign, shelves, the small repairs that make a house admit you. He looked out at the yard. A row of low stakes marked the future of a garden. In his mind, he saw zinnias, marigolds, a stubborn line of tomatoes that would refuse to grow straight. He pictured her small wrists muddy to the watchband, the sun bleaching her hair in uneven streaks by August. He let that picture sit until it felt real enough to touch. From inside, a clock chimed the hours soft as a sigh. The rain thinned to mist. On the sign, droplets gathered in the groove of the W and shone like tiny coins. Lena reached over without looking and laid her palm on the cedar, the way a person might steady a sleeping animal. Her hand stayed there a long moment, Then she tucked it back into the knit of her sweater. He thought about the other porches he had known. Forward operating bases with plywood steps and sand in the seams. Front stoops where goodbyes were practiced until the faces could hold them without breaking. This one was smaller. It held the rain differently. It didn't ask anything but presence. Light worked its way under the clouds. The maples along the road went from slate to a quiet green. A single bird found its note and tried it once, then again, less tentative. Lena leaned into his shoulder in a way you could miss if you weren't the one receiving it. He stayed very still, not to trap the moment, but to let it choose to remain. Later, there would be papers to sign, appointments, the slow grind of systems that prefer neat boxes to living hearts. There would be days when the past came back sharp and days it came back soft. But not now. Not here. Caleb slid his thumb along the edge of the step until he felt a splinter lift, and he pressed it back with a small act of care no one would ever notice. The rain eased to nothing. The sign dried a shade lighter. A faint warmth pushed through the damp. He didn't say it aloud, but the words moved through him like breath, steady and sure. You're home. Dusk unrolled itself, gentle and blue. They stayed on the porch until the first porch light on the street blinked awake, and then a second, as if the town were remembering how to keep watch. When they finally rose, it was unhurried. The door clicked shut on the quiet behind them, and the house accepted it. On the cedar, the letters held their dark. Warren home. Not perfect lines. Not perfect hands. Enough. And the thought that closed the day came without fanfare, simple as the last drop slipping from the eave. Every child deserves to be believed, at least once in their life. Spring rain tapped lightly on the porch roof, each drop landing with the steady rhythm of a heart finally slowing down. Caleb and Lena sat there without speaking, wrapped in the same blanket. The new wooden sign behind them, Warren home. In the dim light of late afternoon, Lena's face no longer carried the guarded look she had the day he found her by the cemetery gates. Her eyes now knew where to rest. Caleb's did too. No fireworks. No cheers. Just a quiet moment, the kind you have to travel a long road to earn. Some stories, when they end, don't truly end at all. They leave you with a quiet question. If you met a child like Lena, what would you do? And maybe this is where I'd like to hear from you. Tell me about a time you trusted, or were trusted, if only once in your life. Because sometimes it's those small acts of trust that keep us close enough to stay.